Hey nerds, this is a time-lapsed curated version of the betta fish tutorial from my Saturday workshop. If you want to see the full version of this tutorial, I'll have a link to that live stream down in the description below. Betta fish were requested by Indie Kitty during one of the chats, and I decided to paint two of them using a collection of watercolors, metallic and more opaque watercolors, as well as Stonehenge's black watercolor paper. This is our reference betta fish. I'll pop a link down in the description below to the original source. This video was recorded on a secondary recording device, so it is a little bit off kilter. The view's a little bit strange. I do apologize for that. The full version has a completely different angle since it was recorded using a webcam. So we start out with our sketch. I used the Pilot Color Eno in yellow for this because I knew it would show up on that black paper, especially on camera. You can use graphite because you're not necessarily going to be recording this to share. This was the first fish I painted in this style. I don't normally work on black watercolor paper, but I do have a kitchen sink review where I tested a whole bunch of different products on this paper to find out what would work. So we are using white gouache, which you can't really see. It's in a multi-well daisy palette. And we're also using the Daniel Smith Ultimate Mixing Set, since many of these colors are semi-opaque to opaque, and I thought they would show up well on this paper. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm applying some white gouache using a watercolor brush. I think it's a silver black velvet watercolor brush, so it's something that's soft and that's flexible. A synthetic brush might not work so well with this because it might have a tendency to lift up prior layers. So my work approach for this one isn't one that I would necessarily recommend. I was basically creating a base layer. As you guys saw in the reference, the fish was very, very opaque. There wasn't a lot of black shadow. There wasn't a lot of black delineation, which the contrast of the white and red on a black background was really striking, and that's what drew me to this image. So what I ended up doing is I ended up filling a lot of the area, and I wanted to do a lot of wet into wet blending with the white gouache and the semi-opaque kind of scarlet red from Daniel Smith. Now, something you can do on this black paper, especially with more opaque paints, is you can build up these layers of opacity. So you can start with a really thin layer of color and add subsequent layers to build that color up and make it more opaque and make it brighter. And this would be a great paper for gouache. I'm not necessarily much of a gouache artist. I am somewhat familiar with it and I have used it, but it's not necessarily my favorite medium. Generally, I really love the translucency and vibrancy that we get from watercolor, so that's why I prefer to work with translucent watercolor. But this would be a great one for using gouache. So I'm mixing in a little bit of cerulean blue and a little bit of ultramarine blue because if you guys looked at the reference image, you'll notice there's a bit of iridescence on the body of the fish, and I wanted to try and capture that. So basically what I'm doing with this is I am applying a base layer, and then I was going to go on top of it with metallic watercolor. And kind of by this point in the painting, I'd kind of started hitting my stride. I kind of figured out that I really needed to be leaning very heavily on my brushwork and moving away from trying to do fills. So this is where it's kind of started to click for me. And during the stream, we talk a lot about trying new things and making mistakes and learning from mistakes. And I feel like this painting was an opportunity for me to try something new and to learn something new. So with the red, we really did a lot of wet into wet blending because we applied it while the gouache was still wet, so it would diffuse out into it and pick up some additional opacity. Now I'm going back into the head of the fish because the head had these really brilliant red tones that my first layer wasn't able to achieve. So what I wanted to do was add some white and then paint the red back on top of that. And then I'm also going back into the fins and adding more definition and adding more opacity. So at this point, we are well and truly in the ugly stage. And it's important to point this out because I know a lot of artists hit this stage and they start getting really discouraged. Honestly, during the stream, I was a little embarrassed by how bad this looked. But fortunately, the people who come and hang out during the stream, they feel like my friends. I feel like I can be vulnerable and make mistakes around them. And they're not going to just throw me to the wolves, which is so nice. It's so nice to be able to have that kind of relationship, especially during live streams. So it kind of emboldened me to not just throw this away, but to see what could be done to salvage it, to take some risks, and to possibly make some mistakes. So on the body of the fish, I felt like I'd gone too far with the blue, so I added some white, and then I started dabbing in cerulean and ultramarine blue again, wet into wet, hoping that it would kind of diffuse and give this mottled look. And I added more towards the bottom to kind of create additional shadow. I also went in and added more white on the fins. So if you're doing this at home and you're not a gouache person, Chinese watercolors, which are designed to be more opaque, or Gansai style watercolors, Calvin in the chat recommended Gansai. And there are some opaque colors, so I think if you selected your Gansai colors carefully, those could be used to great effect here as well. So you're not necessarily limited that much in the supplies you use. And in the kitchen sink field test, I think I even did the Chinese watercolors. I tried all kinds of different things on this paper. So I'll link that down in the description below, and hopefully that'll spark some inspiration for you guys. So often with art, we have to make a mess. We have to make it almost unsalvageable, and then we have to figure out how to save it, how to make it something we like, or how to make it something the client likes if you're doing it as a commission or if you're doing it as freelance work. So that's the challenge here. Now I want to point out that I used a hairdryer to dry this. It was raining the night I recorded it. It was very humid. We were having long dry times. And frankly, I do not like sitting around watching paint dry while on live stream. I can be entertaining, but I don't think I have 20 minutes of random talking entertainment in me. So I used the hairdryer. Once the pigments had kind of settled into the paint, the water wasn't pooled, it was just very damp. I used a hairdryer just to kind of finish it and get it to dry. And you guys can see that that layer of white gouache on the head has worked so well for getting the red to pop off the black of the paper. The red in this Daniel Smith set is semi-opaque, which does mean it will stand out on the paper, but it wasn't standing out quite as much as I wanted it to. So adding some red on top of the white, not mixing the red and white, that would have made pink, but adding some red on top of the white was a really strong decision that worked quite well in this instance. I'm just going in and kind of redefining some of the red and adding some additional red to make it a bit stronger. So this is a painting where there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of painting and then adding gouache to kind of take it away and then adding another layer. There was a lot of like trying to figure out my work process and what I wanted from this and what I wanted it to look like in my mind. So unfortunately, I didn't go into this with a strong idea of what I wanted, which is why there's so much back and forth. Normally, if I'm doing a new technique on YouTube, I spend some time practicing it and figuring it out beforehand. And I did not have time the week before. So this is my practice. This was my figuring it out. But I think that's useful because it models this sort of behavior that's often not seen on YouTube. And I think there's a lot of artists or people who are interested in art who they never see people going through the figuring out process, going through the experimental process. They only see, this is how we do such and such. It's this and this and this and this and this. So I think demonstrating this and showing the mistakes and showing the learning process and showing the thought process is important for those who cannot maybe go to art classes or cannot go to art school, who might not otherwise learn how to think about pursuing the art that they want to create and how to learn the materials enough to be confident in using it, because there's going to be a lot of making mistakes when you're making art. We just don't always show it on social media. Okay, so the fish actually looks pretty good at this stage, but I'd promised metallic watercolor and I felt guilty for not delivering on that. So I decided to go in with some of my Fine Tech and Hydrocolor watercolors and add some metallic accents. And this is kind of a divided opinion because I think doing that was a mistake. But the person who liked the piece and I gave the piece to likes the iridescence. So that's a good point of like taste varies. What you want in a piece can vary. What the customer wants versus what you think looks good can vary. So it's really very subjective, but I added a bit of iridescent, kind of like this light pearlescent iridescent with a blue sheen to the body of the fish. And then I went in and I added like blue silver pearlescent color, and I added pearlescent red, and I added pearlescent gold to the eyes. And I do think the pearlescent gold in the eyes was a good decision, but I think that should have been the only pearlescent on the fish so that we have that one light reflecting element. So with this, you want to be careful not to add too much water. You want to apply your pearlescent paints pretty thickly, because if you add too much water, you're going to reactivate your gouache, you're going to reactivate your prior watercolor layers, and it's going to turn to mud. So you want to make sure, ideally you want to make sure your base coat is fully dry before you start painting on your pearlescent colors, particularly when you're working with these more opaque, semi-opaque colors, because those can turn to mud really quickly. So something that's cool about this piece is as we were painting it, I really started to build up my confidence. I started to figure out what I wanted to do with this, and the chat was so supportive that I decided I wanted to paint another fish. I wanted to give it another try, and I wanted to go in full metallic, no other colors. So I have a follow-up tutorial, which is more together, it's more streamlined, fewer mistakes, fewer figuring myself out, where we use just metallic watercolors on the black watercolor paper to paint a really nice metallic fish. And that one's my favorite. So I hope you guys will check that one out as well. That video is going to be coming up soon. I do apologize for the Dutch angle. I know for some folks that's way too distracting. I'm still trying to perfect the dual camera setup. And Joseph pointed out that, hey, you're recording your live streams to your hard drive. You could just time-lapse that. So that might be an area I go in the future. We're going to see about that in the future. But I did have a lot of fun painting this fish. I had a lot of fun hanging out with people. I had the face cam on. I had the mic on. So it was, for me, it was a lot like hanging out. And it was just chilling and painting with art supplies on a Saturday night when everybody's kind of stuck at home for quarantine. So I really enjoyed this. If you've never joined me for one of my Saturday night art workshops, I hope you'll do so in the future. You can keep an eye on the community tab for information about those. So I'll see you guys again really soon. Bye guys!